The ink on the agreement had not yet dried when Clara Whitfield understood that the man standing across the table from her had no intention of making this easy. He had not looked at her once since she stepped through the door of the lawyer's office, not when Mr. Haskell read the terms aloud, not when she signed her name in the careful, unhurried script that her schoolteacher mother had spent years drilling into her, not even when the pen scratched the last letter and the sound of it filled the small room like something final being sealed. Elias Cord stood at the window with his back to the proceedings, one hand resting on the frame, looking out at the dust-white street of Harlan Creek, as though the entire matter were happening to someone else entirely. She did not take it personally. She had learned, in the 4 years since Robert died and left her with his debts and his good name and precious little else, that a man who would not look at her was simply a man who had already decided what she was and saw no reason to revise that opinion. What she was, in the estimation of most of Harlan Creek, was a liability dressed in a widow's gray. Mr. Haskell cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Cord, the terms are as follows. The Cord homestead, its livestock, its acreage, and the deed held against it will be transferred into joint ownership upon signature of this marriage contract. Mrs. Whitfield's assumption of household and financial management duties satisfies the condition of the creditor's extension. The arrangement stands for a minimum of 1 calendar year, at which point either party may petition for dissolution, provided the mortgage balance has been reduced by no less than 40%. Clara folded her hands in her lap. Elias said nothing. Mr. Cord, Haskell said carefully, do you have any questions regarding the terms? No. He turned from the window then, finally, and looked at the desk rather than at her. His jaw was set like iron, left too long in cold weather. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 34, 35, big through the shoulder, a scar along the left side of his chin that he had not bothered to hide. He picked up the pen, signed the document without reading it again, and set the pen down with a quietness that felt deliberate. She watched his hands. A man's hands, she had always believed, told more truth than his face. His were calloused at every joint. The knuckles had been split and healed and split again. The nails were clean. Whatever else Elias Cord was, he was not a man who had let his land die without fighting it. That was something. That was, in fact, the only thing that had made her say yes when Haskell first brought the proposal to her 3 weeks ago in this same office, with winter already threatening at the edges of the season and her own borrowed room above the milliner's shop growing colder by the night. The wedding itself was a brief, almost apologetic ceremony. Reverend Alcott performed it with the studied neutrality of a man who had learned not to ask questions about the arrangements that kept frontier towns running. 2 witnesses from the church, the sexton and a woman Clara did not know, stood with arms folded against the November chill. There were no flowers. There was no music. When Alcott announced that Elias could kiss his bride, the man beside her turned his head and pressed his lips to her cheek so quickly and so coldly that she was not certain it had happened till she felt the brief warmth of his breath against her skin. He offered his arm to escort her out of the church. She took it. The contact lasted as long as the 3 steps down to the road, and no longer. The wagon ride to the Cord Ranch was 40 minutes of silence, broken only by wind and the occasional complaint of the axle. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her carpetbag wedged between her feet and watched the plains open out ahead of them. The grass had gone amber with the season. The sky was the particular shade of pale blue that appears just before a country turns serious about winter. She noted 2 fence lines in disrepair, a section of wire that had been cut and not replaced, and a water trough near the first outbuilding that had tilted off its posts and been propped back up with a length of timber. She filed all of it. The ranch house was exactly what she had expected from the ledgers Haskell had allowed her to review before she signed. Weathered board siding, iron stove visible through the front window, a porch that had once been level and no longer was, a barn behind it that was larger and in better condition than the house, which told her everything she needed to know about where Elias Cord's priorities lived. She had not yet climbed down from the wagon when the front door opened. They came out in a line, as though they had been waiting, which, she would later understand, they had. 3 of them. The eldest was a girl of perhaps 10, dark-haired and solemn-eyed, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large, and an expression that Clara recognized immediately as the particular watchfulness of a child who has been managing something alone for too long. Behind her, a boy of 7 or 8 with his father's jaw and none of his father's composure, who was visibly trying to decide between wariness and curiosity and landing somewhere unstable between the two. And last, clutching the back of the girl's coat with both fists, a child of no more than 4 who had Elias Cord's same dark eyes and was studying Clara with the frank, unguarded attention that only very small children and very old people still permitted themselves. Elias climbed down from the wagon. He didn't look at her. He looked at the children. "This is Mrs. Cord," he said. His voice was flat, informational, the same tone a man might use to announce a change in the weather schedule. The eldest girl's eyes moved from her father to Clara and back again. She said nothing. The boy said nothing. The small one released the coat and took 2 steps forward into the dust, still staring. Clara climbed down without waiting for assistance. She picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the porch. When she reached the bottom step, she stopped and looked at the 3 of them directly. "My name is Clara," she said. "You don't have to call me anything else until you're ready." The eldest girl's expression shifted, fractionally, barely, but Clara caught it. It was not warmth, it was something more careful than warmth. It was the first small measurement of a child deciding whether a person could be trusted with the truth. She went inside. The kitchen smelled of iron and old ash and the specific cold that settles into a house when no one has been tending it with any softness. The stove was out. The wood box was low. There were dishes stacked in the dry sink that had not been washed in at least 2 days. She set her carpet bag on the floor beside the table and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, taking a full inventory. Then she opened her bag, found her apron, and tied it on. Behind her, through the still open front door, she heard the small child's voice, clear, carrying, entirely without guile, announced to its father, "I like her." She heard Elias Cord say nothing in response. She began to build the fire. The children's names, she learned, were not offered by their father. She gathered them the way she gathered everything in those first days, through observation and patience and the willingness to be still long enough that the truth of a place revealed itself without being asked. The eldest was Nora. She had decided this before the girl said a word, because the name suited her, something steady and old-fashioned about her, a quality of endurance in the set of her shoulders. She was right. The boy was called Tobias, though he answered to Toby with the easy indifference of a child who has not yet developed opinions about his own name. The smallest, the one with Elias Cord's dark, serious eyes and no fear of strangers, was May. She announced this herself on the first morning, standing in the kitchen doorway in a flannel nightgown that dragged the floor, watching Clara build the fire with the focused attention of someone witnessing a performance they have been waiting some time to see. "May," she said, pointing at herself. Then she pointed at Clara and waited. "Clara," Clara said. May nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went to find her shoes. Elias had been gone since before first light. Clara had heard him, the creak of the front door, the particular deliberateness of a man moving through a house he did not want to wake. She had lain in the narrow bed of the room he had shown her the night before, watching the ceiling gray into visibility with the early dawn, and she had taken the full measure of her situation without sentiment. She was here. She had signed the paper. She had made the choice with her eyes open and her calculations exact. The ranch had 40 head of cattle that could be brought to 45 with careful management. The mortgage held against it was 2 years overdue on its interest payment. The creditor, a man named Hargrove, whose name Mr. Haskell had spoken with a particular careful neutrality that told Clara everything about what kind of man Hargrove was, had agreed to the extension on the condition that the household demonstrate evidence of stability. A wife, a functioning home, the appearance, at minimum, of a future worth lending against. She understood what she was in the structure of this arrangement. She was collateral made human. She did not find this humiliating. She found it clarifying. The kitchen, once the fire was built and the stove had begun to throw its warmth into the corners of the room, was not without its merits. There was a good iron pot. The flour bin was low, but not empty. There were 6 eggs in a cloth on the shelf and a half wheel of hard cheese that would serve a few more days. She made a proper breakfast for the first time since she had moved into the milliner's spare room. Biscuits rolled out on the scarred table, the cheese sliced thin, the eggs poached rather than fried, because Tobias, she noticed, watched the process of poaching with something near reverence, and she suspected it was not a method he had encountered before. The three children ate at the table without conversation. Nora ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had been responsible for her own hunger for long enough that the act of food appearing was not something to be celebrated, merely completed. Tobias ate everything on his plate and then looked at Clara's to see if she was finished with hers. She slid it toward him without comment. May ate half her biscuit, put the rest in her dress pocket, and announced that the horse was hungry too. "The horse has his own breakfast," Clara said. May considered this. "Does he know? I expect your father saw to it before he left." Nora's eyes came up briefly at the mention of her father. Something moved in them, not resentment, not quite worry, something adjacent to both. She looked back at her plate. After breakfast, Clara washed the dishes and then stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard. The fence line on the north side was what she had noted from the wagon, 2 posts leaning at angles that would not survive a hard winter. The barn was sound, as she had suspected. There was a kitchen garden bed to the east of the house that had been put to sleep for the season, but not badly. Whoever had kept it before had known what they were doing. She filed this also. She found the ranch ledger in the second drawer of the desk in the small room off the front hall that served as Elias Cord's office. She knew she was not meant to find it. She also knew that no one had explicitly told her not to look, and that in the absence of instruction, she would operate according to her own judgment, which was the only judgment that had reliably served her in 4 years of navigating other people's disasters. The ledger was a record of a man fighting a losing battle with genuine skill. The entries were methodical, precise, written in a hand that was larger and less polished than her own, but no less careful. Every expense accounted for, every head of cattle numbered. The problem was not mismanagement, the problem was drought. In the summer of 1881, followed by a brutal winter in 1882 that had taken 14 head of cattle and 1 entire growing season in rapid succession, the mortgage, taken out against better years, had become a stone tied to the ankle of a man still trying to swim. She understood, reading it, why he had agreed to this arrangement, not because he had wanted a wife, but because he had run out of options that did not cost him the land, and the land was clearly the only thing left that mattered to him in the way that something matters when a person has already let everything else go. She closed the ledger and replaced it in the drawer exactly as she had found it. She was still standing at the desk when she heard the front door and then boots on the floorboards, not the children's light-footed movement, but the deliberate weight of a man who has been outdoors since dawn and has not yet decided what to do with himself indoors. She turned. Elias Cord stood in the doorway of his own office with mud on his boots and an expression that moved very quickly from surprise to something harder. "Those are my accounts," he said. They are," she said, "and they tell me the south grazing parcel is being underused relative to its carrying capacity. You could rotate an additional 8 head through it between now and spring without overgrazing, which would increase your sale weight by March." The silence that followed was the kind of silence a man produces when he has prepared himself for conflict and been handed something he did not expect instead. "I didn't ask for your opinion on my grazing." "No," Clara said, "you didn't." She moved past him into the hall, keeping a full foot of distance between them as she passed. "Supper will be at 6. The children told me they prefer it earlier, but I suspect 6 is when you come in, and a family that eats together is more convincing to a creditor than one that doesn't." She did not wait to see his face. She went back to the kitchen and began to think about what could be made from what remained in the larder, and she did not permit herself to feel the way her heart had struck the inside of her ribs when he had said, "Those are my accounts," in that particular flat, hard voice. She did not permit it because she knew, with the cold clarity that had been her only reliable companion since Robert died and left her to manage alone, that feeling things about Elias Cord would be the most expensive mistake she could make in this house. Supper that first evening was a quiet, watchful affair. Clara had made a pot of beef stew from the last of the salt-cured meat she found wrapped in cloth on the cold shelf, stretched with dried beans and 2 wizened carrots that had survived the season in the root box beneath the floorboards. It was not elegant. It was hot and it was sufficient, and it smelled, she knew, like something a home was supposed to smell like, which was, she suspected, a thing this kitchen had not produced in some time. Elias came in at 6 minutes past 6. He washed his hands at the basin without being told, hung his coat on the hook beside the door, and sat at the head of the table with the particular deliberateness of a man reasserting the geography of his own house. He looked at the pot. He looked at the table, which Clara had set properly. Plates, spoons, the folded cloth she had found in the linen drawer and shaken out and smoothed flat. He said nothing. The children sat. May climbed onto her chair and immediately looked into her bowl with the same focused assessment she applied to everything. Tobias sat beside her and watched his father's face the way children watch weather, reading it for information that would tell him how the evening was going to go. Nora sat across from Clara and unfolded her cloth with a care that told Clara the girl had been the one keeping this household's surface appearances intact for longer than any 10-year-old should have been required to. "Grace," Elias said, one word, a command. They bowed their heads. He spoke 4 words, a brief, plain address to God that asked for nothing and stated less. Then he picked up his spoon, and they all followed. The meal passed in near silence. Clara did not attempt conversation. She had learned in her years managing Robert's household, and in the years after managing his debts, that a table where silence is the established language cannot be broken by a newcomer without cost. She would let the silence be what it was and find her place within it gradually, the way you find solid ground in mud, one careful step at a time, testing before committing weight. It was May who broke it, as Clara was beginning to suspect May broke most things. "Clara made the stew different," May announced to no one in particular. "It's better." Tobias froze. Nora's eyes went briefly to her father. Elias's spoon paused at the rim of his bowl. He did not look at Clara. He looked at May with the expression of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by what comes out of that particular child's mouth, but has not yet developed a reliable response to it. "Eat your supper," he said. May ate her supper. She also said, approximately 40 seconds later, "Is Clara staying?" The question landed in the room with the precise accuracy of a thrown stone hitting still water. Clara set her spoon down quietly. She kept her eyes on her bowl. "That is not a supper question," Elias said. "When is it a question?" May asked. "May." Nora's voice, soft but firm, the voice of a child who has practiced managing her younger siblings in the absence of a consistent adult hand. May looked at her sister, seemed to measure something, and returned to her stew. Clara looked up then and found Nora watching her. The girl's expression was careful, assessing, and carried in it a quality Clara recognized because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. The look of someone who has decided that hope is a thing to be rationed carefully, deployed only when the evidence justifies the expense. She held the girl's gaze without flinching and without the false warmth that children that age could detect and despise on instinct. After a moment, Nora looked away. Elias pushed back his chair when his bowl was empty. He carried it to the dry sink himself. This surprised her, and then stood for a moment with his back to the room. "Herd needs moving at first light," he said, and she understood this was addressed to no one, or perhaps to the room itself, or perhaps to whatever part of him was still working out the logistics of having a stranger in his house who had read his ledger without flinching. He went out. Clara cleared the table. Nora helped without being asked, and this time Clara allowed it, because the gesture was not servitude, but a child's way of establishing herself in the new order of things. Tobias disappeared in the direction of the barn, which Clara suspected was where he went when the house felt crowded with things that weren't being said. May sat on the kitchen floor with a piece of rope she had produced from somewhere and began a complicated process that appeared to involve tying knots and narrating the process to herself in a low, continuous murmur. "She does that when she's thinking," Nora said very quietly beside Clara at the dry sink. "What does she think about?" Clara asked. "People," Nora said, "whether they're going to leave." Clara washed the bowl in her hands without speaking. The water was cold. She'd forgotten to heat it, and the iron rim of the basin was colder still. Outside, the wind had picked up with the early dark, pressing at the kitchen window in long, slow pulses. "I told her you weren't staying," Nora added. The words were delivered without accusation, simply as fact. As information that it seemed fair Clara should have, Clara set the bowl on the shelf. "What made you tell her that?" "Everyone leaves." Nora's voice did not waver. She was 10 years old, and she said it the way adults say things they have stopped expecting to be contradicted about. "Or they stay, but they stop being here. My mother stopped being here before she left." "That was worse." Clara turned to look at her. Nora was watching May on the floor with her rope, and her expression had the specific quality of someone standing guard. "I am not going to make you promises," Clara said, "about what I will or will not do. I don't know this place well enough yet to promise anything about it, but I will tell you this. When I know, you will know first, before your brothers, before anyone." Nora considered this for a long time. The wind pushed at the window again. May tied her 7th knot and said something approving to it. "That's fair," Nora said finally, and she picked up the next bowl and handed it to Clara to wash. She did not know, in that moment, that May had already gone to find her father in the barn. She did not know that May had climbed the stall rail and perched there while Elias worked by lantern light and announced, in her clear and carrying voice, that Clara had said her name like it was important, and that she thought Clara was staying even if Nora didn't, because Clara had fixed the loose latch on the cabinet door before supper without anyone asking her to, and people who were not staying did not fix latches. She did not know that Elias Cord had stood very still in the lantern light with a curry brush in his hand, and said nothing for long enough that May climbed down from the rail and went back inside on her own. She did not know that he stood there for some time after, alone in the barn, with the horses breathing softly around him and the lantern throwing its yellow light across the straw, thinking about a woman who had read his ledger without flinching and made supper from nothing and told his daughter the truth instead of a comfortable lie. She did not know any of it. She banked the stove for the night, checked the latch on the front door, and went to her room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the dark and allowed herself briefly 2 things she had not permitted all day. The first was tiredness. The second was the small, dangerous acknowledgement that the children in this house were not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared for indifference or for resentment or for the blank-faced wariness of children whose trust had been forfeited too many times to be easily re-extended. She had not prepared for May's certainty, or Nora's devastating fairness, or the way Tobias had looked at her plate as though hunger was something a person had to apologize for feeling. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and told herself, with great precision and deliberate firmness, that she was not staying because of the children. She was staying because of the terms of the contract and the calculation she had made with clear eyes and a solvent mind, and the children were simply part of the arrangement, like the stove and the fence posts and the ledger in the desk drawer. She was almost certain she believed it. Outside, the wind settled, and the plains went dark and wide and silent, and the Cord Ranch sat in the middle of all that silence, like a thing that had been holding its breath for a very long time, waiting to see what would happen next. 3 days passed. Clara learned the ranch the way she had learned every difficult thing in her life, methodically, without complaint, starting with what was broken and working outward from there. The cabinet latch had been first. Then, the split handle on the water pail, which she wrapped tight with a strip of leather cut from the worn edge of a harness she found hanging unused in the barn doorway. Then, the gap beneath the kitchen door that had been letting the cold crawl in across the floorboards each night, which she packed with a length of rolled burlap and a strip of old wool blanket she found in the bottom of the linen trunk. She did not announce any of it. She did not present it for approval or acknowledgement. She simply moved through the house and the yard with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has long since understood that the work does not care whether anyone notices it being done, only whether it gets done. Elias noticed. She knew he noticed because he was the kind of man whose eyes missed very little, even when his face committed to missing everything. She would come into a room and find his gaze moving, briefly, to the thing she had repaired or reorganized, and then moving away again before she could confirm she had caught him looking. He said nothing about any of it. He came in for meals, ate with the same focused efficiency as his eldest daughter, and went back out. He answered direct questions with direct answers, and volunteered nothing beyond the minimum the situation required. On the 4th morning, he came into the kitchen before she had finished making the breakfast and stood at the window in his coat, looking at the yard, and said without turning, "I'm moving the south herd to the creek pasture today. Be gone till after dark." "I'll keep supper warm," she said. A pause. Don't trouble yourself." "It's no trouble," she said. "It's a pot on a stove." He left without responding. Through the window, she watched him cross the yard to the barn, and she permitted herself one moment of something that was not quite frustration and not quite amusement, a feeling that had no good name, but that she recognized from her years with Robert, from every conversation she had ever attempted with a man who had decided that receiving help was the same thing as admitting defeat. It was Tobias who began to follow her first, not deliberately, she thought, or perhaps deliberately, in the half-conscious way of children who manufacture proximity without admitting they are seeking it. She would be splitting kindling at the woodpile and look up to find him sitting on the fence rail, watching. She would be working in the root cellar and hear him on the steps, ostensibly looking for something he could not name when she asked. She did not make anything of it. She simply kept working, and she talked while she worked. Not to him exactly, but not away from him either. About what she was doing and why. About the best way to split a log along the grain. About which root vegetables stored longest, and how to tell by smell when something had turned. On the 5th day, he handed her a piece of kindling without being asked, and she said, "Thank you, Tobias," in the same tone she would use with any capable person performing a reasonable task, and something in him went visibly quiet and settled, the way a nervous horse settles when you put a hand on its neck without ceremony. Nora was more deliberate in her approach. She appeared in the kitchen each morning after breakfast and waited to be assigned something. Clara assigned her things, real things, not child tasks, not make work. She put Nora in charge of the egg count and the feed measure, and she showed her how to record both in a small notebook Clara had found at the bottom of her carpet bag and given over entirely for this purpose. Nora received the notebook with both hands in the expression of someone being handed something they did not know they had been waiting for. May, for her part, required no cultivation. May had already decided. She appeared wherever Clara was with the reliability of a shadow that has chosen its person and sees no reason to revisit the decision. It was on the 6th day that Clara found the discrepancy. She had been working through the household accounts, the smaller ledger, separate from the ranch operation book that tracked the domestic expenses of the house. It was a mess. Not Elias's doing, she thought. The entries were in 2 different hands, the earlier ones in the same careful script as the ranch ledger, the later ones hurried and uncertain, trailing off entirely 8 months ago. Someone had been keeping these accounts and then stopped. She did not ask why. She could see why in the shape of what was missing. The domestic hand simply ceased, mid-page, in a month that corresponded with nothing she could identify except absence. But the discrepancy was not in the old entries. It was in a more recent one, a payment recorded against the household account that did not correspond to any supplier she could identify, in an amount that was not large enough to be alarming, but not small enough to be routine. $42, paid to an entity recorded only as H and marked with a date 6 weeks prior. She copied the figure into her own small notebook, wrote the date beside it, and closed the ledger. That evening, Elias came in after dark as he had said he would, and she put the supper on the table without fanfare. A proper meal, beans cooked long with what remained of the salt pork, cornbread from the last of the good cornmeal, a jar of preserved plums she had found at the back of the cold shelf that she judged were still serviceable. She set his plate without looking at him directly and went to check on May, who had been put to bed an hour ago and had a facility for not staying there. When she came back through the hall, she heard him stop. Not a sound exactly, more the cessation of sound, the particular stillness of a man who has paused without intending to. She stepped into the kitchen doorway and found him standing at the table with his hat in his hand, looking at the set place, the full plate, the jar of plums opened and spooned into a small bowl. He looked up and found her watching. She expected him to say something dismissive, something that re-established the distance he maintained with the reliability of a man who has decided distance is the only thing keeping him intact. He said, "You didn't have to do the plums." "They would have turned in another week," she said. "Still." He set his hat on the hook and sat down. She turned to leave him to it. "Clara." She stopped. It was the first time he had said her name. Not Mrs. Cord, which he had not used once since the lawyer's office, and not the careful nothing he had been using instead. Her name, said in a voice that was not warm exactly, but was no longer the iron-flat tone he had used in every exchange before it. She turned back. "The south parcel," he said. He was looking at his plate. "You were right about the carrying capacity. I moved 8 more head through this afternoon." A pause. It held. She looked at him for one full moment. He did not look up. "Good," she said. And she went down the hall to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and told herself, firmly and with complete conviction, that the way her name had sounded in his mouth was entirely without significance. She told herself this until she almost believed it. In the morning, May climbed into her bed at first light and announced that she had told her father Clara was staying and that her father had not said she was wrong. Clara looked at the ceiling. Outside, the planes were just beginning to lighten at the far edge. The cold pressed at the window. The stove would need building. The herd would need checking. The ledger, with its $42 mystery entry, would need a conversation she was not yet ready to have. She had not come here to feel anything. She had come here to fulfill a contract with precision and exit with her dignity intact. That had been the plan. It had been a good plan. May pulled the blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes with the complete confidence of someone who has already decided how the story ends. Clara lay in the cold morning light and did not quite manage to disagree. A week into their arrangement, a man rode onto the Cord Ranch from the eastern road. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. She noted the horse first, too well kept for a neighbor, too deliberately presented for a casual call. Dark bay, brushed to a shine that had no business being out on a working ranch road in November. The man rode it with the particular ease of someone who has money enough that ease has become a habit he no longer notices. He was perhaps 50, broad through the middle, wearing a coat that had not come from any mercantile in Harlan Creek. She had the $42 entry in her mind before he dismounted. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the front door. Elias was in the barn. She could hear the rhythm of work from across the yard, the measured sound of a man who does not waste motion. She stepped onto the porch before the visitor reached it. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes moved across her with the quick, cataloging assessment of a man who is accustomed to measuring things for what they can be turned into. "I'm looking for Cord," he said. "He's occupied," Clara said. "Can I help you?" The man's expression shifted into something that was almost a smile. "You the new wife?" "I am Mrs. Cord," she said. "And you are?" A pause that lasted a beat too long. "Hargrove," he said. "Abel Hargrove. I hold the note on this property." She had already known. She kept her face entirely still. "Mr. Hargrove, my husband is in the barn. I'll let him know you called." "I'll wait," Hargrove said. He said it pleasantly, with the pleasantness of a man who has never had to ask for anything twice and finds the experience of being made to wait mildly entertaining rather than inconvenient. She stepped off the porch. "Then I'll take you to him." She did not look back to see if he followed. She walked across the yard toward the barn with her skirt brushing the frost-stiffened ground, and she used the 12 steps it took to steady herself into the version of herself that she needed to be for whatever was about to happen. Elias looked up when she came through the barn door. His eyes moved past her to Hargrove, and something happened in his face, a tightening, a closing down, so swift and complete that if she had not been watching for it, she would have missed it entirely. "Cord," Hargrove said, with the warmth of a man greeting someone who owes him money. "I was in the county. Thought I'd stop in and meet the new arrangement." His eyes moved to Clara. "Seems you've done well for yourself." "Mr. Hargrove," Elias's voice was flat iron. "The extension runs to the end of March," Hargrove said conversationally. He moved into the barn with the ease of a man who considers the space already his. "I wanted to see the place. Make sure things are settled." "They're settled," Elias said. Hargrove smiled. He looked around the barn with an appraiser's eye, taking in the horses, the equipment, the order of the space. His gaze landed on the tack wall, the neat arrangement of tools, and Clara watched him register it with the calculating attention of a man counting assets. "You're behind on 2 interest payments, Cord. The extension was a courtesy. Courtesy has a limit." He let that sit. Then his eyes moved to Clara again, a slower look this time, less cataloging and more deliberate. "Although I'll say, the place looks better than when I was here in September." Someone's been working. My wife manages the household accounts, Elias said. The words were said without inflection, but Clara heard in them something she had not expected. A statement of fact, yes, but also something that functioned in the language Elias Cord used as a declaration. Hargrove looked at her with new attention. Is that so? The household is in order, Clara said. The stock count is up. We expect to meet the March condition without difficulty. She paused. I reviewed the payment history against the original note terms this week. The interest calculation applied in September appears to include a compounding adjustment that was not specified in the original contract language. I'd want to verify that before the next payment is made. The barn went very quiet. Hargrove's expression did not change, but his eyes did, a small, cold sharpening that told her she had found something real. I'd need to see the contract, he said. Of course, Clara said pleasantly. We'll want our own copy reviewed by a lawyer in Harlan Creek before any further payments are made. Standard practice. Hargrove looked at Elias. Elias was looking at Clara with an expression she could not read, something between startlement and a quality she might, if she were being imprecise, have called recognition. I'll be in touch, Hargrove said. The pleasantness was still in his voice, but it had gone thin at the edges. He tipped his hat to Clara with the exaggerated courtesy of a man who has just discovered he may have underestimated someone and is deciding how he feels about it. Then he walked out of the barn, and a minute later they heard the dark bay moving back up the eastern road. The silence he left behind was a different quality of silence than the barn usually held. Clara smoothed the front of her apron. The compounding adjustment, Elias said. His voice was careful. Is that real? I don't know yet, she said honestly. I haven't seen the original note, but the way he looked when I said it suggests it might be. Elias stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes, something she had not seen in him in the 9 days she had been in this house. Not warmth, not gratitude, something more unsettling than either, the look of a man who has revised an estimate and is not entirely comfortable with the magnitude of the revision. Where did you learn to do that? He said. My father was a contract lawyer, she said. He had no sons. The silence stretched between them. Outside the barn, the wind moved through the yard, lifting a small spiral of dust near the water trough and setting it down again. Somewhere up the eastern road, Hargrove and his well-kept horse were growing smaller against the plains. Elias looked down at the curry brush in his hand. He set it on the rail. He picked it up again. He said, without looking at her, I'll get the note from the deed box tonight. I'll need good light to read it, she said. There's a lamp in the office. She nodded. She turned to go. Clara, she stopped. The second time he had said her name, it was different from the first time. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate, as though he had chosen it rather than simply used it. She waited. He'll come back, Elias said. Hargrove, and he won't be pleased. No, she agreed. He won't. You understand what that means. For you. Being the one who... He stopped, looked at the barn wall, started again. He has influence in this county. Men who work for his interests. I understand, she said. He looked at her then. A full, direct look. The first one he had given her that was not a glance or an assessment or a careful withholding. A look that lasted long enough to mean something. All right, he said, and that was all. But that evening, he moved the second lamp from the bedroom into the office without being asked, and when Clara came in after the children were in bed to begin reading through the deed box, she found the original mortgage note laid out on the desk, unfolded and weighted at its corners with smooth stones, waiting for her. If you've been listening from the beginning, you already know that Hargrove isn't finished, and you might be wondering whether Clara is going to find what she's looking for in that contract. Stay with us. The next part changes everything. She found it on the 3rd page. The original mortgage note was a dense document, written in the cramped formal script of a bank clerk who had been trained to compress as much obligation as possible into as few readable lines as possible. Clara read it twice before she trusted what she was seeing, and then she sat back in the chair and looked at the lamp flame and thought about what it meant. The compounding adjustment was not in the note. It was not in any rider, addendum, or attached schedule. The interest rate was fixed at 6% per annum, simple, payable in 2 installments yearly. What Hargrove had been collecting, she ran the calculation in the margin of her notebook with the precision her father had spent years drilling into her, was closer to 9%, compounded quarterly, applied retroactively to the balance as of the first missed payment. The difference over 2 years was not $40, it was not $80. It was $114 applied against a principal that had already been reduced by Elias's payments, inflating the apparent arrears and extending the period of the extension indefinitely. It was not accidental arithmetic. It was a method. She sat with this knowledge for a long time in the lamplight, listening to the house settle around her into its nighttime sounds, the creak of the boards contracting in the cold, the soft movement of wind against the office window, the distant shift of horses in the barn. The fire in the stove had burned to coals. The cold was coming back into the corners of the room. She heard the front door. Not the children. They had been in bed for 2 hours, boots on the floorboards. A pause at the office doorway. Elias looked at her face before he looked at the papers. "You found something," he said. She turned the notebook toward him and set her finger on the calculation. "He's been charging you 9% compounded. Your note specifies 6% simple. The difference over the arrears period is $114 charged against a balance you should not have owed in those amounts." He came to the desk. He stood close enough that she could smell the cold on his coat and the wood smoke that lived in the wool of it. He looked at the numbers. His jaw tightened in the way she had come to recognize, not anger exactly, but the expression of a man absorbing information that confirmed something he had suspected and hoped was wrong. "He's been doing this for 2 years, Elias said. "At least," she said, "I'd want to see the payment receipts against each installment to be certain." "I have them." He moved to the deed box and found them without needing to search, a man who knew exactly where every record of his own loss was kept. He laid them on the desk beside the note. She began to cross-reference without being asked, and he stood at the edge of the lamplight and watched her work. She was not performing. She was not aware of being watched, or rather she was aware and had chosen to proceed anyway, because the work was what mattered, and what he thought of her doing it was a secondary concern. She moved through the receipts with the methodical speed of someone for whom numbers had always been a language more reliable than words, clear, bounded, honest in a way that human beings rarely manage to be. After a while, he pulled the second chair to the desk and sat down. They worked through it together, though he said very little. He confirmed dates when she asked. He identified 2 receipts that had been issued with different reference numbers than the corresponding ledger entries, a discrepancy that suggested Hargrove's bookkeeping had a gap in it that a lawyer would find interesting. Clara noted everything. By the time the coals in the stove had gone fully dark and the cold had settled into the room in earnest, she had a complete accounting of the overcharge, documented and cross-referenced, written in her clearest hand. She set the pen down. This is enough," she said. "Not to defeat him outright. He has men in this county and influence at the land office that money of this kind buys, but enough to contest the extension terms formally and compel a recalculation of the arrears. If a lawyer in Harlan Creek will take the case, you could reduce your effective debt by 1/3 and reset the payment schedule on the actual contracted terms." Elias looked at the papers. He looked at her notebook. He said nothing for a long time. "Why?" he said finally. She met his eyes. "Why what? Why work this hard?" A pause. "You've been here 11 days. You don't know if this land is worth saving. You don't know if I am." He said the last sentence without self-pity, which made it more honest than most confessions she had heard. "You could have done the minimum the contract requires and nothing more." Clara folded her hands on the table. "I could have," she said, "but failing serves neither of us. That was the arrangement I agreed to, not the minimum version of it." He watched her. The lamplight was low now, the oil nearly gone, and in the dimness his face had lost some of the careful blankness he maintained in the daylight hours. She could see the tiredness in it, the years of it, the particular exhaustion of a man who's been holding something together alone for so long that he has forgotten what it felt like before the weight. "My wife," he said. The words came out slowly, as though he was testing them for structural integrity. "She left 4 years ago, took the girls and Toby to her sister in Missouri, brought them back 8 months later, and then—" He stopped. His hands on the table were very still. She died of a fever that spring. Before anything was... He did not finish the sentence. Clara did not fill the silence. She let it be what it was. I didn't tell Haskell to find a wife, he said. I told him to find someone who could manage accounts. He said this was the better solution. A pause. I wasn't certain he was wrong. He wasn't, Clara said quietly. Something shifted in his face, not the almost smile she had catalogued from a distance. This was something that did not reach the surface, but moved beneath it, like light passing through deep water. He stood. He began to gather the receipts and return them to the deed box with the same care he had used taking them out. She capped the ink and closed her notebook. Their hands passed close over the desk twice, not touching. At the doorway, he stopped. The doorway pause. He had done this before. She had noticed it. The habit of a man who had learned to leave rooms before conversations could require more of him than he had decided to give. There's a lawyer in Harlan Creek, he said. Baines. He has no love for Hargrove. He looked at the doorframe rather than at her. If I were to bring him this documentation, would you come? To explain the calculation? She looked at him in the dim room. The lamp gave its last pulse of light and steadied. Yes, she said. He nodded once as though this settled something beyond the practical arrangement they had just made. Then he was gone down the hall, and she heard the creak of his door, and the house went quiet. She sat for a moment in the cooling room. She thought about what he had said, not the facts of it, the plain history of a man and a woman and a fever and 4 years of holding a ranch together by will alone, but the manner of it. The way he had said it as though he had not planned to and had not stopped himself in time. She thought about the receipts and the numbers and the quiet hour at the desk and the twice close passing of hands that had not touched. She told herself, with less conviction than she had managed on any previous night, that this was still only the arrangement, the calculation, the contract with its terms. She almost believed it. She took the cold lamp and went to bed, and outside the plains lay black and white and frost silver under a sky full of stars that had been burning long before any of this and would burn long after, indifferent to what two people in a cold office had failed to say to each other across a desk, scattered with evidence of a man who had been cheated and a woman who had refused to let that stand. The ride into Harlan Creek took 40 minutes and was almost entirely silent. Clara sat beside Elias on the wagon bench with the deed box on her lap and her notebook inside her coat, and the cold coming off the plains in long, flat waves that the wool of her shawl was not quite equal to. She did not say so. She watched the road and the grass gone amber on either side of it, and thought through the conversation with Baines that she had been rehearsing since she woke before dawn to find the house already smelling of coffee. Elias up ahead of her again, the pot on the stove, a cup set out on the table that had not been there the night before. He had not mentioned the cup. She had not mentioned it either. She drank it standing at the window watching the frost on the yard, and understood that they had arrived, without discussion, at a new arrangement within the arrangement, one that had not been written into any contract Haskell had drawn up. The town appeared on the horizon as a line of weathered board fronts against the pale sky. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a mercantile, a feed store, a church, a smithy, a saloon that was respectable before noon, and less so after, and a collection of houses along the main road that ranged from established to aspirational. It had the quality of a place that knew its own importance and was not entirely certain the rest of the territory agreed. Elias brought the wagon to a stop in front of a narrow building between the land office and the dry goods store. A painted sign above the door read, Thomas Baines, Attorney at Law. The paint was old. The sign was level. Clara found this combination reassuring. She climbed down before he could consider whether to offer his hand. Inside, Thomas Baines was a lean man of 60, with a gray beard kept close and eyes that moved with the quick cataloging intelligence of someone who had been reading between the lines of documents for 40 years and found it more interesting than reading the lines themselves. He looked at Clara when Elias introduced her, and then he looked again, the second look being the one that actually registered her. Mrs. Cord, he said, what have you brought me? She laid the documentation on his desk in the order she had arranged it that morning, the original note first, then the payment receipts, then her notebook opened to the calculation page. She walked him through it without preamble, pointing to each figure as she named it, explaining the discrepancy between the contracted rate and the applied rate, identifying the two receipts with mismatched reference numbers. Baines said nothing until she finished. Then he looked at Elias. "Where did you find her?" he said. "Haskell," Elias said. Baines looked at the documents again. He picked up the notebook, read through the calculation, set it down. He laced his fingers together on the desk and looked at the ceiling briefly, in the manner of a man performing a private arithmetic of his own. "Hargrove has done this before," he said. "Not to this county. He's careful here. But I've had letters from a lawyer in Calhoun County who described a nearly identical pattern on 3 separate notes." He looked at Clara. "Your documentation is the first time anyone has caught the mechanism in writing and traced it back to the original contract language." A pause. "This is actionable." Clara felt something release in her chest that she had not known she was holding. "What does actionable mean in practical terms?" Elias said. "It means I can file a formal contest of the extension terms with the Territorial Land Office and demand a recalculation of the arrears based on the contracted rate. Hargrove will fight it. He has friends in that office, but he cannot manufacture language in a contract that does not contain it, and this," Baines tapped the notebook, "makes that impossible to dispute without committing outright fraud in a legal proceeding." He sat back. "He'll know, when the filing arrives, who put it together." "He'll know already," Clara said. "He was at the ranch 2 weeks ago. He saw me." Baines looked at her steadily. "Then you should know that Hargrove does not lose gracefully." "I didn't expect he would," she said. Elias had not spoken in several minutes. She could feel him beside her in the way she had become, without intending to, accustomed to feeling him, the particular quality of his stillness, the way his silence had different textures depending on what he was thinking. This silence had something in it she could not entirely read. She did not look at him. "File it," Elias said. Baines nodded. He began to make his own notes. He asked several clarifying questions, all of which Clara answered, and by the time they left his office, the pale winter sun had climbed to its modest noon height, and the main street of Harlan Creek was in its fullest daily motion. It was at the Mercantile that it happened. They had stopped for flour and cornmeal, and a length of rope Elias needed for the south pasture fence. Clara was at the counter working through the order with the proprietor, a thin-faced man named Garvey, who ran the store with the efficiency of someone who has decided that warmth is an overhead cost he cannot justify, when she heard the door and felt the temperature of the room change. Not the temperature from outside. The social temperature. The particular shift that occurs in a public space when someone enters who changes the calculation of everyone already present. Hargrove. And behind him, 2 men she did not know but recognized by type, the kind of men whose primary professional qualification is their willingness to stand near someone who has money and look like a consequence. He saw her before he saw Elias. His eyes moved across her with the same appraising look he had used in the barn, but stripped now of any pretense of pleasantness. "Mrs. Cord," he said, loud enough for the room. She turned fully to face him. "Mr. Hargrove, I hear you've been consulting lawyers." He said it with the mild tone of a man commenting on weather. The room had gone very still. Garvey had stopped moving behind the counter. A woman near the fabric bolts had stopped pretending to examine them. "I've been reviewing contract documents," Clara said. "It's standard practice when a payment schedule appears to deviate from written terms." Hargrove smiled. "A woman who reads contracts. Cord, you've done something interesting here." Elias had come to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her, close enough that his arm was an inch from hers. He said nothing. He looked at Hargrove with the flat, cold attention of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it. "I'd be careful," Hargrove said, still pleasantly, to Clara specifically. "This county is not large. People who make unnecessary difficulties tend to find the difficulties returned." The room was entirely silent. Clara looked at him for a long, measured moment. She thought of the $114. She thought of the 2 mismatched receipt numbers. She thought of the letter Baines had mentioned from Calhoun County, 3 separate notes, the same pattern, and the men who had lost their land to it without ever understanding the mechanism, because no one had handed them the original contract in the time to read it properly. "I appreciate the counsel," she said. "We'll see you in the land office, Mr. Hargrove." She turned back to Garvey and finished the order. Behind her she heard Hargrove's footsteps, a pause, and then the door. His men followed. The room exhaled. Garvey, who had not said a word through any of it, began wrapping the flour with slightly more speed than was strictly necessary. It was the woman near the fabric bolts who spoke. Clara did not know her. A neighbor, perhaps. A rancher's wife, gray at the temples, with the hands of someone who worked outdoors and the eyes of someone who has been paying attention to Harlan Creek for a long time. "Well," the woman said, to no one in particular, "it's about time, somebody." Several people in the room found reasons to suddenly be doing other things, but not before Clara had seen what she needed to see. The small shift in the room's posture, the recalibration, the slight turning of faces that meant something was being revised in the public accounting of who Clara Cord was and what she amounted to. Outside, they loaded the wagon in silence. When the last sack was settled and Elias had tied the rope off at the back, he stood at the side of the wagon and did not immediately move to climb up. Clara waited. He put his hand on the side of the wagon. He looked at the street. A muscle moved in his jaw. "You didn't have to stay in that room," he said. When he came in, "You could have stepped back." "I know," she said. "Most people would have." She looked at him. The winter light was flat and honest, and it showed everything. The tiredness, the years, the thing behind his eyes that had been building for 11 days and had no name either of them had yet been willing to apply to it. "I'm not most people," she said quietly. He looked at her then. The full look, the one that lasted long enough to mean something, the same one she had received once before in the barn and had been telling herself did not mean what it looked like since. He raised his hand. She thought, for one suspended moment, that he was going to touch her face. His hand came up and she did not move away from it, and the cold air between them was very thin. He lowered his hand. He turned and climbed up onto the wagon bench. She stood in the street for one breath. 2. Then she climbed up beside him, and he clicked the horses forward, and they moved out of Harlan Creek and back onto the road that ran between the town and the ranch, and the plains opened out around them wide and cold and indifferent, and neither of them said a word for the first 10 minutes. Then Elias said, without looking at her, "Nora asked me last night if you were staying." Clara watched the road. Her hands were folded in her lap. "What did you tell her?" she said. A long pause. The wagon wheels turned on the hard dirt. The wind moved through the grass on either side of the road. Somewhere to the south, a hawk turned slow circles against the pale sky. "I told her I didn't know," he said, "that it wasn't my answer to give." Clara looked at the horizon. She thought about the lamp set out that morning, the cup of coffee, the name said differently each time, the hand raised and lowered in the street. She thought about Nora's face, and May on the kitchen floor with her rope, and Tobias handing her a piece of kindling with the quiet desperation of a child offering what he has. She thought about what it would cost her to say the true thing and what it would cost her not to. "It may be," she said carefully, "that I am better suited to this place than I expected to be." The wagon moved on. Elias said nothing, but his shoulders, which she had watched for 17 days now with the close attention of someone learning a new and difficult language, changed, released something they had been carrying. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was the first completely honest sentence she had spoken about her own heart since she signed her name in that lawyer's office, and it hung in the cold air between them like smoke from a good fire, visible, real, and warmer than the temperature around it had any right to be. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Thursday, carried by a rider who handed it to Clara at the door with the indifferent efficiency of a man who delivers consequences for a living and has long since stopped thinking about them. She read it standing on the porch in the cold morning air. Elias was behind her in the doorway before she had finished the second paragraph. She did not ask how he knew to come. She had simply accepted, somewhere in the past week, that he had developed the same awareness of her movements that she had developed of his. "Hargrove filed a counterclaim," she said. "He's contesting Baines's filing on the grounds that the extension agreement supersedes the original note terms." "He's not trying to win the argument," Elias said. "He's trying to make the process long enough and costly enough that I run out of ground to stand on before the land office rules." She folded the letter. "Then, we need to make the process short." The next 3 days were the most concentrated work of Clara's life. She wrote to the lawyer in Calhoun County whose name Baines had mentioned, composing the letter with surgical precision, identifying the pattern, requesting documentation of the 3 cases he had encountered, explaining what she had found and what it implied about a systematic practice rather than an isolated dispute. She found 2 procedural deficiencies in Hargrove's counterclaim that a judge would be required to address before the substance could even be considered. She worked at the desk each evening after the children were in bed. Elias worked beside her, not on the legal documents, but on the ranch accounts, building a clear picture of the operation's genuine viability. They did not talk much during these hours. They worked in the lamplight in the particular companionable quiet that 2 people develop when they have stopped needing to fill silence with performance. On the second evening, she looked up and found him watching her instead of the ledger. "You're not what I thought you were," he said, simply the plainest form of truth he was apparently capable of delivering. "What did you think I was?" she said. "Someone passing through, someone making the best of a poor hand until a better one appeared." A pause. "Now I think this place has more of a future than it did 3 weeks ago. And I think that is not a coincidence." She looked back at her papers. He looked back at his. The lamp burned between them, warm and steady, and outside, the November plains pressed cold against every window of the house and found nothing inside it to extinguish. It was Nora who saw Hargrove's man first. She came in from the yard with her coat half-buttoned and her eyes carrying the careful urgency of a child who has assessed a situation and decided the adults need to know immediately. "There's a man at the south fence. He's been there since first light. He's not looking at the fence." They came out onto the porch together. One of Hargrove's men, mounted, still, making no effort to conceal himself, simply there, visible, the way a threat makes itself visible when its purpose is pressure rather than action. "He wants you to go out there," Clara said quietly. "He wants you to confront him and give Hargrove a reason to claim interference. Don't. That man at the fence is there because Hargrove is afraid of what we're about to file." Elias looked at the man at the fence. He looked at her. He went back inside and told Nora to keep the younger ones in the house, then returned to the porch and stood beside her until the man at the fence understood he was not going to get what he had been sent for and rode back up the eastern road. The Calhoun lawyer's response arrived the following week, detailed with copies of original note documents from all 3 cases. The judge assigned to the matter was a territorial appointee with no financial relationship to Hargrove. Hargrove sent a letter 3 weeks later that contested nothing and requested renegotiation under the original note terms. The interest recalculation reduced the arrears by $119. Clara read the settlement letter at the kitchen table with May on her lap and Nora's record notebook open across from her. "It held," she said. Elias came to the table. He put his hand on it, not reaching, simply placed, offered in the way a man offers something when he does not yet have the language for what he means. She put her hand over his. May said, "I told Nora you were staying, was I right?" Clara looked at Elias. His face had nothing of iron in it, nothing of distance. It was the face of a man who has put down a weight so long carried that he had forgotten it was not a permanent condition of being alive. "Yes," Clara said, "you were right." Later they sat on the front porch in the cold, the plains silver and vast before them. He reached over in the dark and took her hand without announcement, without asking permission, as though it were simply the next right thing and he had decided to stop finding reasons to delay it. She let him. The kerosene lamp in the kitchen window threw its small warm light into the yard, reaching about as far as a lamp ever reaches, which is not very far at all, and was enough.